The Thin Man Goes Home. By the mid-40s, the Thin Man franchise was showing signs of fatigue. The fourth film, Shadow of the Thin Man, released in 1941, drew mixed reviews. Respectable, but hardly the spark it once was. Myrna Loy, having spent much of World War II volunteering with the Red Cross, was said to be hesitant to reprise her role as Nora Charles. Though she never publicly declared she was finished with the character, her return wasn't guaranteed. Still, MGM wasn't ready to shelve one of its most bankable duos. Studio publicity at the time leaned on the idea that fans were clamoring for more Nick and Nora, with rumors suggesting a steady stream of letters urging a comeback. Whether fact or marketing spin, it worked. Loy agreed to return. Released in January of 1945, The Thin Man Goes Home marked a noticeable shift. Gone were the urban speakeasies and high society banter. This time the action unfolded in Nick Charles' quiet hometown. The change in setting brought a softer tone, with the mystery taking a back seat to domestic comedy. The film leaned into the culture clash between Nick's sleuthing lifestyle and his father's disapproval, subverting expectations for a fifth installment. Surprisingly, it clicked. The film became a box office success and earned praise for its charm, with critic Bosley Crowther highlighting the enduring chemistry between William Powell and Myrna Loy. Some dare to guess that MGM briefly toyed with the idea of spinning the franchise into a television series as early as the late 1940s, though nothing came of it at the time. A TV adaptation would eventually surface in the late 1950s. But The Thin Man Goes Home stands out for doing what few sequels manage, revitalizing an enduring series without repeating the formula. It wasn't a sequel anyone was demanding, but it turned out to be exactly what audiences wanted. The Fly. When The Fly debuted in July of 1958, it wasn't intended to spark a series. A grim sci-fi horror tale with a tragic twist, it stood alone, until it didn't. Less than a year later, Return of the Fly hit theaters in July of 1959. Nobody was clamoring for a follow-up, especially after the original's director, Kurt Newman, passed away in August of that same year. The sequel landed in the hands of Edward Burns, a seasoned B-movie director known more for speed than subtlety. The budget was trimmed, the color was stripped, and most of the cast didn't return. But one name did, Vincent Price. And that changed everything. Price, who had a modest role in the original, stepped into the spotlight here. His presence alone gave the film a stamp of genre legitimacy. The story shifted to the late scientist's son, now grown and obsessed with correcting his father's legacy. The result? A darker, more brutal, and oddly gothic entry that leaned into its black and white aesthetic. What initially seemed like a cost-saving move ended up enhancing the film's eerie tone, especially for late-night audiences and drive-in double features. While critics weren't dazzled, fans embraced its pulpy charm. Whispers even suggest that this follow-up helped cement Price's pivot from dramatic actor to horror icon, though his rise in the genre had already begun. And while Return of the Fly didn't launch a franchise in its era, others believe its unexpected success kept the property alive long enough to inspire future reimaginings, including the now iconic 1986 version by David Cronenberg. Not bad for a sequel nobody was waiting for. Return to Payton Place. Return to Payton Place in 1961 had every reason to flop. Sequels in mid-century Hollywood were a gamble, especially without original stars or directors. The first film, a 1957 adaptation of Grace Metalius's explosive bestseller, was a cultural juggernaut. So when 20th Century Fox fast-tracked a follow-up just 4 years later, few expected much. Lana Turner and director Mark Robson were gone. In their place, a younger cast, a tighter budget, and a script many feared would water down the original's provocative edge. But the result defied expectations. Carol Lindley, stepping into the role of Allison Mackenzie, brought a sharper, more assertive presence. While Diane Varsi's absence was noted, Lindley's performance earned praise for capturing the restless energy of a new generation. One review from the New York Times described her portrayal as less dreamy, more defiant, a shift that mirrored the film's broader tone. Return to Payton Place didn't shy away from controversy. It tackled censorship, ambition, and class tensions head-on, reflecting post-war anxieties in ways that surprised critics. Jeff Chandler, cast as newspaper publisher Louis Jackman, was rumored to have pushed for deeper character work, allegedly clashing with studio executives who preferred a safer, more sanitized script. A handful of film historians suggest Chandler saw the project as a chance to elevate the material, even as the studio trimmed costs compared to the original. Despite lukewarm critical reception, the film subtly succeeded. It grossed over $6 million domestically, impressive for a sequel with no marquee names and no franchise blueprint. Many surmise its unexpected run helped set the stage for the Payton Place television series, which launched in 1964 and became a primetime staple for 5 seasons. That show would go on to launch the careers of Ryan O'Neal and Mia Farrow, extending the franchise's cultural reach far beyond what anyone imagined when the sequel hit theaters. Return to Payton Place may not have matched the original's prestige, but it proved a sequel could stand on its own terms, and occasionally even surprise. The Bowery Boys Meet the Monsters. By the time Allied Artists released The Bowery Boys Meet the Monsters in April of 1954, the franchise had already churned out over 30 films, most following a predictable formula of streetwise antics and slapstick. With audiences growing weary, this 33rd entry looked like a desperate genre detour, a horror comedy featuring mad scientists, a robot, and a gorilla named Atlas. Yet against all odds, it struck a bizarre chord. The film leaned hard into absurdity, placing the boys inside a gothic Long Island mansion owned by brain-transplanting eccentrics. While mainstream critics barely acknowledged it, younger viewers allegedly embraced its cartoonish chaos. Film historian Don Miller later observed that the Bowery Boys' late-era films veered into surreal territory, and many fans point to Meet the Monsters as the point where that shift truly solidified. Gossip has lingered for years that the film's unexpected popularity may have helped extend the series' lifespan, opening the door for other genre mashups like The Bowery Boys Meet the Mummy in 1955. Though overlooked in many retrospectives, this oddball sequel has gradually earned cult status among fans of mid-century horror comedy hybrids. Strange how a formulaic franchise found new life with a haunted house, a family of maniacs, and a gorilla in a tuxedo. The Bride of Frankenstein. In 1935, Universal Pictures made a move that baffled even industry insiders. They approved a direct sequel to a horror film, something practically unheard of at the time. The original Frankenstein, released in 1931, had already become a cultural monolith and a financial triumph. So when talk of a sequel surfaced, most assumed it would be a quick cash-in. But director James Whale wasn't on board. According to film historians, Whale initially dismissed the idea, wary that a follow-up might cheapen the original's legacy. Rumors suggest he only agreed to return after Universal offered him full creative control, a condition he reportedly used to push the sequel into unexpected territory. The result was The Bride of Frankenstein, a film that didn't just continue the story, it transformed it. Rather than rehashing the terror of the first movie, Whale shifted the tone entirely, embracing dark satire and emotional depth, and a surprisingly human take on monstrosity. Boris Karloff reprised his role, but this time the creature spoke, mourned, and longed for companionship. Critics didn't know what to make of it at first. One early review from the New York Times called it grotesque and fantastic, full of macabre touches and sardonic wit, a tone few expected from a horror sequel. Elsa Lanchester's dual role as Mary Shelley in The Bride became an instant sensation, despite the bride appearing on screen for less than 5 minutes. Her electrified hair, angular movements, and piercing stare locked her into horror iconography almost overnight. Behind the scenes, costume designer Vera West and the makeup legend Jack Pierce reportedly spent weeks fine-tuning her look. Many thought that early versions were deemed too frightening even for Whale's taste. Despite Whale's reluctance and the genre's low expectations for sequels, The Bride of Frankenstein became a critical and commercial hit. It's one of the rare cases where a follow-up not only matched the original's impact, but arguably surpassed it. Today, it's regularly cited as one of the greatest horror films ever made, a sequel nobody asked for, but one that reshaped the genre's possibilities. The Bells of St. Mary's. In December of 1945, a sequel quietly hit theaters that no one had demanded, yet it ended up topping the box office across 2 years. The Bells of St. Mary's followed on the heels of Going My Way, which had introduced Bing Crosby as the affable Father Chuck O'Malley. A religious drama in an era dominated by noir and post-war escapism, it sounded like a misfire. Instead, it raked in around $8.5 million in domestic rentals, outgrossing heavyweights like The Lost Weekend and Mildred Pierce. According to Variety, it became the top-grossing film of both 1945 and 1946. Crosby reprised his role, but the unexpected spark came from Ingrid Bergman as Sister Benedict. Numerous reviewers argued she outshone Crosby with a performance the New York Times called radiant and restrained. Their dynamic avoided cliché romance, opting instead for mutual respect and emotional depth, a rarity in sequels of the time. Despite initial skepticism from critics wary of sentimental follow-ups, the film earned 5 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Actor, and Best Actress. Director Leo McCarey took home the Oscar for Best Original Story. Various observers proposed that McCarey's decision to release the film just before Christmas was a strategic move to tap into post-war sentimentality, an emotional undercurrent that resonated with audiences still processing the trauma of World War II. Behind closed doors, it was said that studio executives were hesitant to approve the project, fearing it lacked commercial appeal. But its success may have changed minds in Hollywood, subtly influencing how character-driven sequels were viewed. The Bells of St. Mary's didn't rely on spectacle or shock. It leaned into sincerity. And in a town often allergic to quiet storytelling, that was a real surprise. The Curse of the Cat People. In 1944, RKO did something few studios dared. It greenlit a sequel that barely resembled its predecessor. The Curse of the Cat People followed the surprise horror hit Cat People from 1942, but instead of returning to shadows and suspense, it veered sharply into a quiet, lyrical exploration of childhood isolation. Critics were baffled. Some didn't even recognize it as a sequel. Simone Simon reprised her role as Irina, but this time as a spectral presence in a child's imagination, more guardian angel than predator. The stalking menace was gone, replaced by snow-covered gardens, imaginary friends, and a blurred line between fantasy and reality. Production was rocky. Co-director Gunther von Fritsch fell behind schedule, prompting RKO to bring in Robert Wise, a former editor who had recently co-directed Mademoiselle Fifi. This marked one of Wise's earliest solo directing efforts, long before he gained acclaim for The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951 or West Side Story in 1961. Back then, he was experimenting with subtlety and mood, crafting a film that felt more like a psychological fable than a horror sequel. Trade outlets like Variety called it a curious blend of fantasy and reality, unsure what to make of it. Audiences expecting another monster movie were taken by surprise, but over time the film's gentle tone and emotional depth earned it a cult following. Certain movie scholars now regard it as a quiet trailblazer for psychological fantasy in cinema. Many insist that directors like Guillermo del Toro drew inspiration from it when crafting films like Pan's Labyrinth. Whether or not that's true, The Curse of the Cat People remains one of Hollywood's most unexpected sequels. Less a continuation, more a reinvention. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. Abbott and Castello meet Frankenstein. By 1948, Abbott and Castello were losing steam at the box office. In Universal's iconic monsters, Dracula the Wolfman and Frankenstein's monster had seen better days. So when the studio greenlit a crossover that fused the fading comedy duo with its aging horror legends, it looked like a last-ditch gimmick. It wasn't. Abbott and Castello Meet Frankenstein blindsided critics and audiences alike, pulling in an estimated $3 million domestically, a major win for a film nobody had requested. It marked the first time Universal's 3 flagship monsters shared the screen, a novelty that added to the spectacle. Bela Lugosi returned as Dracula, for only the second time since his 1931 debut, after nearly 2 decades of avoiding the role that typecast him. Many presume he only agreed due to dwindling roles and financial strain. Lon Chaney Jr., reprising the Wolfman, allegedly demanded his character be treated seriously, and the film honored that, letting the monsters play it straight while the comedy unfolded around them. Critics expected tonal chaos. Instead, it struck a bizarrely effective balance between real suspense and slapstick timing. It not only revived Abbott and Castello's career, but also extended Universal's monster legacy, spawning a string of follow-ups like Abbott and Castello Meet the Invisible Man. A number of film scholars even consider this the unofficial send-off to the studio's classic horror era, as the monsters shifted from terror to parody. Decades later, it's still cited as a blueprint for horror comedy hybrids, long before Ghostbusters or Shaun of the Dead ever existed. The Return of Frank James. In 1940, The Return of Frank James defied low expectations for a Western sequel. and did so under the unlikely direction of Fritz Lang, an Austrian-German filmmaker making one of his first American films. Known for the haunting expressionism of Metropolis and M, Lang brought a shadowy, psychological edge to the sun-drenched frontier. Instead of doubling down on action, the film leaned into moral complexity. Henry Fonda returned as Frank James, delivering a performance critics described as subdued and introspective, a stark shift from the more heroic tone of the original Jesse James from 1939. The New York Times noted the film was more contemplative than thrilling, an unusual compliment for a genre dominated by shootouts and spectacle. Jean Tierney, in her screen debut, added fresh appeal to the cast. While conventional wisdom suggested Western sequels were box office filler, this one carved out something different. Rumors at the time hinted that studio executives were unsure about Lang's slower, moodier approach. But the gamble paid off. Commercial success followed, and the film quietly helped nudge the genre toward deeper character studies seen in later classics like High Noon and The Searchers. A sequel no one clamored for ended up being a turning point, just not the kind anyone saw coming. Father's Little Dividend. Released in 1951, Father's Little Dividend was never meant to make history. Sequels in old Hollywood were rare, often dismissed as lazy retreads. But this follow-up to Father of the Bride bucked expectations, and unassumingly set a precedent. MGM brought back Spencer Tracy, Joan Bennett, and Elizabeth Taylor, who had just turned 19 at the time of release, though she was 18 during filming. The plot flipped the script from wedding jitters to impending grandparenthood, with Tracy's Stanley Banks reluctantly preparing for a new role in the family. Domestic, understated, and far from glamorous, the story somehow struck a chord. Audiences weren't just entertained, they were charmed. Vincente Minnelli returned to direct, preserving the tone and warmth of the original. While exact box office numbers vary across sources, trade publications at the time reported a strong financial return. Critics noted the film's subtle humor and Tracy's performance, with several reviews highlighting his ability to balance frustration with affection. Some industry insiders apparently questioned whether a sequel was even necessary. Rumors swirled that MGM only greenlit it to capitalize on Taylor's rising star power. Whatever the motive, the result was a surprise hit that proved sequels didn't have to be cynical cash-ins. Decades later, the same formula would echo in the Steve Martin-led remake and its own sequel. But back in the early 50s, Father's Little Dividend quietly challenged the stigma around sequels, and won. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.